It was run in Barnes Theatre in London in 2010, and energized by that I've written several other books, romantic comedy, transgender duology, and the science fiction novel as well. And also over the years I've been blogging about science and about literature, and I noticed there are a lot of people asking me about new Russian books. So they knew about classical Russian literature and some Soviet authors such as Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov, but I had no idea what is now. I mean, it seems like with the collapse of Soviet Union, the Russian literature disappeared as well. So due to the lack of this information, I kept giving advices of what to read in a particular genre. A lot of people ask me why not to actually create a comprehensive guide about modern Russian literature. So I started doing this first as a series of blogs at my website, and then eventually I've put on a guide on that. So I'll start with, before I switch to guide, I'd like to actually talk about what is Russian literature in the 21st century. How it's different from classical Russian literature. And the thing is, nobody can write like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy nowadays. So you have to write in a different way, and you have to actually explore new ways. Literature has lost its domination status as a major form of media, and now you have to fight for the audience. So in Russia it happened the same way, that as a lot of readers, they turn to television, social media, like in the rest of the world. So writers started experimenting with other forms. For instance, transmedia. Boris Akunin, the best-selling Russian author, he created a serious book called Quest, as essentially is a book application. You can read chapters, and depending on how you answer questions, then you're diverted to a different story path. So it's a game. Mm-hmm. Again, a lot of new authors found their way to fame via screen adaptations. Sergei Lukyanenko has been known in Russia for over a decade as a science fiction author, and then once one of his series was put to screen, Night Watch, and then followed by The Day Watch, he became a best-selling author around the world. His books translated into dozens of languages. Some other authors became prominent not due to necessarily literary merits, but due to their occupation as showmen and celebrities. For instance, such writers include Eduard Limonin, who is famous for his like right-wing activities in Russia, and he's been in prison several times. His biography was published in France a couple of years ago, and won the major literary France Goncourt Prize in France last year. Another person, Tatiana Tolstaya, decently related to Soviet writer Alexei Tolstoy, and she became a very famous TV personality. She's quite heavily present on social media, and she now started publishing her books based on her Facebook posts, actually. So writers nowadays, they explore new forms of how to get connected to readers. And live performance has always been a thing for poets, and nowadays poets, the most prominent include Vera Poloskova, but also even prose writers and journalists, they tend to either give lectures on other writers, or perform their poetry, or read excerpts from their books. The most famous of them is Dmitry Bykov, who is a school teacher and a TV persona, and he tours around the world with his lectures. So I think it's a very good way to introduce Russian literature to the general audience, because people not necessarily going to be swayed by just name dropping and, you know, why should they be reading that particular book, why should they invest in the time. But if they actually attend a talk by somebody or a show, then they become interested in the books as well. So also a lot of books started to be connected in news, and in Russia it's military fiction. For instance, German Sudolaev, he became famous for his books about Chechnya. I Am Chechen, his autobiographical novel, received a lot of prizes in Russian. I recently attended a very interesting talk on how modern Russian literature, why is it so different from Soviet and classic counterparts. It's actually more similar to medieval Russian literature. The talk was by Evgeny Vodolaskin, who just published his new book, Loros, has been translated into English, and this actually appears to be bestseller. It's selling really well, receiving good reviews. It's really, at the moment, the biggest name out there. So he's a specialist in the medieval Russian literature, and he said that the similarities are coming from that the old Russian literature was based on citations. People did not make up new stories. They were using fragments of all the other texts and narratives, putting them together and therefore creating stories. And it wasn't important the person or the exact exact event. It wasn't that important. It was important, the word was important. So, for instance, if somebody would be criticized in Russia, they would, for instance, put a fragment from a completely different book. For instance, it would be from often text from Bible. So, Vodolazkin claimed that essentially the same process is happening in Russia. Only the major citation source is not the Bible, but the whole body of Russian literature. And indeed, we see it in texts of Vodolazkin himself, in Mikhail Shishkin. He is actually in one of his books. He's taken like pages and pages from the memoirs of a Soviet writer whose biography is called "It's My and Mine Only," which is kind of ironic. So, Vodolazkin himself, he also used this fragmentary approach as well by taking citations to arrange his books. So, a lot of modern Russian literature is postmodernism, and they heavily use collage technique in their writing. So, what is the reason to read modern Russian literature? Why is any kind of different? Why not to stick to the local authors? So, first of all, obviously, the writers want new stories and would like to be taken away on new journeys. So, exotic setting. To read, for instance, Olga Slavnikova on the life in the Ural Mountains, for instance, in that region or elsewhere. So, another thing is because Russia is constantly been in political limelight in terms of news. A lot of fiction written is all concerning political and social life in Russia, and that's why if you read the books you actually learn about life in Russia, not from the news, which is very skewed and not necessarily very objective, but from the insider's point of view. Also, another purpose to read literature is all about education. And I mean, this is a big part of the world, and often people lack understanding about these things. Like with a recent Nobel Prize, Svetlana Alexievich, I mean, people find out things everybody knows in Russia, but here you ask a lot of people about, for instance, blockade in Leningrad that happened during World War II, and young generation, even people like below 40 hardly know about these things. So I think it's kind of important as well. It's a very important mission of Russian literature to educate people what's been happening in the country, maybe explain why Russian people the way they are now. Another thing that is actually I mean, almost nobody talks about is the aspect how Russia sees the outside world. That's another thing that is never discussed, and I'll mention this a little bit later. So the insider view of Russian politics. The whole genre of books written about wars and political events. When the war in Crimea, in Ukraine started last year, and Crimea declared independence and then joined Russia. So Vasily Aksionov's The Crimea Island was republished again, and also Orkhanov published his book on the Crimea as well. So there was a plethora of books concerning political events. There were action books on Ukraine as well. So literature immediately reflects on the political events, and that's why it's very interesting, because what is literature? It's distilled knowledge of a nation in a way. So instead of watching the news and very shallow representation of the real events, you can find out how people actually feel about them, about people's experiences rather than just numbers. Another interesting thing is a dialogue about the writers. So in Russia, intelligentsia, in the general kind of establishment, there have always been two groups of people. Ones they believe that Russia has its own very special path, Slavyanophiles, and also pro-Western people, Zapadniki. And so they believed Russia just a part of a European civilization. And nowadays you see the same thing. And the major division again happened when the conflict in Ukraine started, when a lot of people, a lot of writers such as Zakhar Prilepin, he defended the Kremlin point of view and blamed Ukraine on the crisis, while writers like Maxim Kantor, he argued with Prilepin on that point, saying that Russia is an aggressor. So from their books, from their essays, you can learn about this conflict rather than hearing from the outside in a quite in a very elementary way. Okay, so another interesting thing, like mentioned, is Russian literary brand. Obviously, I often keep asked, so who is nowadays Tolstoy? Who is the person who is going to get the next Nobel Prize? Well, now I think tension is a bit out of the pen because Svetlana Alexievich received Nobel Prize. So I think Russia will have to wait for a while till we get another one. But it's still, for a while, it's still been a big argument about that. Do we have any kind of writer of that caliber who will become bigger than just Russian phenomenon, will become international phenomenon? So what are the criteria for that? It could be, I mean, body of work. You have to publish many books on important aspects, and it has to be an epic portrayal of Russian life. It's often not just specific things, so you have to write books on many topics. It has to be maybe a unique or novel literary quality that would make you different from the previous authors, because you cannot just repeat what Tolstoy has done on an epic scale. You have to create something new, perhaps a new genre. And also, translatability is a great issue. For instance, Dmitry Bykov has a couple of books in translation, but they didn't take off here. So is it a bad promotion? Is it a bad translation? So it's a big question. And obviously, people who think about, which next person to promote, whom to invite for next big literary festivals, they think, well, if readers are not that keen, if you don't have that many reviews on literary journals, perhaps it's not that interesting. So, in my opinion, three people are they are major contenders to be the next Tolstoy: is Vladimir Sorokin, Viktor Pelevin, and Lyudmila Ulitskaya. So Lyudmila Ulitskaya is a specialist in the Soviet period and how people live through it. She's focused on family life. She's focused on the past of Russian intelligentsia. And she's her direction is called aestheticism and also humanism. But in a way that is quite similar to what Svetlana Alexievich did, although more from a journalist angle. So that's a question. She's got Ulitskaya has got sufficient body of work to get Nobel Prize, but that's a question of similarity to Alexievich, and that's why I think her reaction to the prize was rather cold. If you read the interviews, I mean, for me, it was the most fascinating thing to read all these people. What was their opinions on the recent Nobel Prize? Fascinating thing, how they tried to, like Dmitry Bykov said, he congratulated Svetlana Alexievich. He was very happy about it, but almost in every single sentence he said, "Well, it's the first Nobel Prize for journalism. It's not literature. It's journalism." So you can see the way people react to these things. So Viktor Pelevin, I think his problem is he's working with so much information, with literary references. They are quite unique to Russian, also with Russian Zen Buddhism, that is not very accessible to foreign readers. I've seen really polar reviews, opinions on his work, so I'm not sure whether he's the next person. Although, I mean, you never know. I mean, some other people were not kind of widely read, but still got the prizes. So you can never predict those things. But I think just by the sheer body of work and just amount of topics he encompassed and just tracked a recent Russian history and how Russia transformed, I think he's the one to watch. Vladimir Sorokin, he started a bit earlier than Pelevin, and I think he did the right choice to become dependent using forbidden things in literature. He used extreme images, pornography, to draw attention to his work. But he's an amazing stylist. He can basically pretend to be like any other authors. He plays with language so effortlessly, and he's got a sufficient body of work from realism to postmodernism, and he writes about the past and future Russia as well. and he's got more. He's a lot more artistic than Pelevin. So in a way, maybe he deserves the Nobel Prize more. And actually, in the Western world, if you talk to like librarians, critics, I think they favor him a lot. So. So he could be one of the contenders, but there's also a second row of people who are started later, but I think they could be great contenders. I don't think they have created their best work yet, because you see them develop. Their latest work are like becoming better and better. Dmitry Bykov, Mikhail Shishkin, Maxim Kantor, and Zakhar Prilepin. Those four, I think, they're still developing and can produce things that will make people talk about them. Okay, so. One of the interesting things I noticed about modern Russian literature recently is these characters who didn't look like people, but the country itself. For instance, and it was all about interplay between being a saint and a sinner at the same time. So my case study is Viktor Yerofeev and his famous book Russian Beauty, which was translated like into 50 languages. The character is Irina Tarakanova. She's a young bisexual woman who comes from periphery to become a fashion model in Moscow. And she's got a really troubled past, failed marriage, she's been raped by her father when she was a child. And she's trying to find her way in the world. And if you think about the country, isn't it the same that happened in Russia, that was plagued with wars and revolutions, that was tortured by Bolshevism, Stalinism, all this propaganda as well, and at the same time was given a promise of hope, of transformation by the church. So, and I see that the same theme of a character being a symbol of Russia in many other books as well. And one of my favorite books I'll mention later, Shame and Purity by Tatyana Moskvina, still to be translated, Позор и чистота. And it is a very short book, yet amazingly how characters in it, they represent a major conflict between, conflict that exists in Russian society. That insatiable urge to live, to consume everything, and at the same time to preserve their purity. So it's also a story of a Russian saint as well. And actually, when I was recently at the talk by Evgeny Vedlaskin, that's what he didn't like about a lot about modern Russian literature. Too many characters are they are too negative, and it's all about this equilibrium being skewed to the sinner side. So he wanted to create a book about a saint, but he couldn't find a saint in the modern world, so he turned to the medieval time to create this. And it's a book about blessed people, about people blаженные, so people who were essentially. So the main characters. The wife died, and this character decided to leave instead of her. He was a famous healer, and so he traveled around and lived life and sacrificed everything for the sake of other people. So, and not surprising, this book actually is really popular around the world, and it shows a different positive face, not very kind of negative view of Russia. So this is quite interesting. So we previously thought that the only thing that is exported from Russia is all negativity, but it's not the case. So people are interested in other aspects of the country. One thing I mentioned before, and I would like to discuss also, is how Russian authors see the outside world. And Russian literature is always criticized for being too into itself. It's all about Russia, its internal affairs. We don't actually really consider ourselves too special, but we don't care what's happening outside. Well, I think it's not true. I think, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are so many people went to live in other countries, and they still preserve language, and they wrote in English. And most of if you think about all these recent prize winners, literary prize winners in Russia, they all live outside Russia: Germany, US, Israel, everywhere. So we take a book like Dina Rubina's Here Comes Messiah. She lived in Russia, in Uzbekistan, and she moved to Israel, and then she wrote a book about this equilibrium, a very kind of human side of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis there. So that's a Russian view of that. That's quite interesting. Another thing is how Russians see Europe, and at the moment we think that often that Europe is doomed due to overpopulation, immigration crisis, and recently Dmitry Glukovsky, famous for his dystopian novels, Metro 2033 and 34, he published a book called Future, which is actually in English that as future.re, like future revolution. And it's actually set in the future Europe where everybody is immortal, but with one caveat is that people are not allowed to have children. While outside Europe people are poor, but they can have children, but they are not allowed to get into the prosperous part of Europe. So there is this conflict. And so the main characters is one of the soldiers that has to find people who try to trick the law and have children, and has to kill those people. And so eventually this system stops working. It's breaking apart, and that's maybe how Russians see the modern day processes, what's happening in Europe. Another book I'd like to mention that is just new book by a crime writer, the most popular writer in Russia, Boris Akunin. It's called The Planet Water, and it's very interesting because it unexpectedly deals with the case of ISIS, a new kind of state, a meta-state. It is what Soviet Union used to be in the beginning of 20th century. So here comes a new state, a new ideology. In Akunin's book, this is a terrorist state that is based in the Caribbean island, underwater colony. They have a cutting-edge technology. They create submarines and try to target all new major superpower underwater. So it's a curious idea. But the thing is, the characters, why they join this terrorist state, and where do they find funding for that? It makes an interesting comparison. People are way too emotional about ISIS at the moment, but if they read this kind of books, maybe they can understand why this process happened, why these countries arise. I mean, what is it? So, as in Akunin's book, because a lot of people were not happy with the established world, what was happening in it, and they were feeling things were unfair, capitalism was unfair. Maybe the same thing was happening in the modern world, where people are not happy with it, and also they're not happy with what happened in the past 30 years in the Middle East, which was plagued by wars. So this is a way how people can reconcile with it, and maybe that's how authors like Akunin, they try to offer a new way out of it as well. So this is quite interesting. So this is an example that Russians are not just into themselves. So how do you find new Russian books, and where do you start? That's an interesting thing. It's so many authors, where do you start? So a good way is to start with anthologies, and I mentioned them on my blog as well. And unfortunately, we don't have a projector, but if you there is an organization called Read Russia, and they published an anthology 2 years ago, which is available on their website. If you go to Read Russia website, it's a PDF, it's a big book. It's short stories by about 30 different authors, and they write literary fiction, military fiction, science fiction, dystopia, like so many genres. It's a good way to sample their fiction and just see if you can find the writers there kind of you can relate to. But also, a publishing house called Glass, over the years they released a number of anthologies dedicated to specific topics. There is an anthology about Russian drama, then also several anthologies on women's prose, written by women's writers, anthology on the Booker winners, debut prize authors, so writers under 35 that won the debut prize in Russia. So it's a good way to, before you start reading big books and invest into that. Another thing is, obviously, most of the publishers who publish books, they have limited amounts of that, and whenever they issue a hard copy, it's available for 20–25 pounds. It's very expensive. So a good way is, if you heard about something, get interested, go to Amazon, go on Kindle, and use the look inside feature there to see preview. If you like the prose, you can then buy it. So it's a good way of kind of searching for these things. But all the same, the problem existed for a number of years. That's why I decided to create this comprehensive guide to Russian literature. One of the problems is how to stratify all the writers. There are so many of them, all are different, and readers nowadays only read celebrity authors because they're famous. But who is celebrity in Russia? How one becomes celebrity? The most widely read author is still Tolstoy, all around the world. And if you look at the news, I talk to journalists, they still say, if we publish article on other writers there and people hardly read them, if it's Tolstoy, you will get lots of clicks. So they keep publishing things on Tolstoy. that's how it goes. It's all about clicks now. So there is a way for Russian writers, and publishers should encourage this, to promote themselves, to become authors. It's to develop a niche audience. You have to be famous with a niche, and then once you have a little niche, then you can expand via the word of mouth and then attract a wider audience. So you have to establish your brand as a niche. And nowadays, I can give you examples. If it comes about Chechnya, it's Garments of Life. If it's Russian Buddhism, it's Viktor Pelevin. If it's retro detective mysteries, it's Boris Akunin. Gluchovsky is king of dystopia in Russia. So it's a good way if you're interested in a specific topic. It's a metadata mechanism, so you can find these things. But at the same time, okay, you have these niches, but people don't actually. There is no way anywhere online you can go and find out about that. That was the major reason I put it all in one book, which is here. And I didn't want to intimidate people by writing a big thing, and also I realized it would take me several years. So initially, when I started preparing materials for it, I had about 1,000 different titles in mind, and I thought, well, that would take me several years to write it, and I wanted to just keep blogging about it, but I decided just to do it in a quick way. And why I've chosen these titles, so there's only about 200 titles that I've chosen, is that they already had in the English translations. So that is what people would be mostly interested in. And some of them, I guess most of them, they're also translated in Italian and French and some other languages. So I subdivided this guide into 16 chapters, and each chapter is a specific genre that is correspond to the theme. So most of the books I mentioned again is literary fiction, but then literary fiction doesn't tell you anything about what is literary fiction. It can be anything, yeah. So instead, I basically put all the books into specific groups. So I have books on religion, on humor, prison life, Soviet period, and also events based in modern Russia. In modern Russia, I have books set in 1990s and Putin's era, and also that includes office prose. Also, I separated science fiction and fantasy as pure genre books from utopia and dystopia as more literary books, because there are more kind of political discussion in them. And anything the politically related books I've separated clearly into military war, political fiction, and dystopia, because I think there are three kind of major categories. There also was a genre which I couldn't categorize into any kind of specific genre. It's a bit of everything. So I called it intellectual literature, although all the other books can be categorized also as intellectual, but it's just they have a very defined genre already. If they're political fiction, it's easy to categorize them there. But some books, they don't belong anywhere. For instance, one of my favorite books, Tea by Viktor Pelevin, is just about anything. So how would I categorize it? So that's why I put the subtitle for it is postmodernism, magic realism, philosophical and metaphysical fiction. And in this chapter I described parts of it. So also for your convenience, since you can read all that and then it's just titles, so you need to find them in the end. So in the end of the book there is bibliography in English and also in Russian, and it's alphabetical, so you can easily find the book. So there's also a link in the end of the book to my online page, and there you can find basically a spreadsheet for all the titles. There's title in Russian, its ISBN number, its Russian bibliography, and then corresponding title if there is a translation in English, and ISBN number. So, and this is all kind of divided by different genres. So it's a lot more manageable for not just for readers, but I guess more useful for publishers, translators, and bookshop assistants also to to go through these things. Okay, so. Interesting things what I learned by doing this guide, not just I discovered a lot of new authors and a lot of new exciting books, but also blind spots. One of the blind spots is Russian family prose. It's by far the biggest genre, and so many writers are writing in it. And even in Russia, people only know a few authors, like Ulitskaya, for instance. She writes about families. But then this genre is often considered to be as a kind of as a boulevard literature. It's cheap literature, but in fact there are lots of very highly accomplished authors in it. They just don't have the same international standing as Ulitskaya, for instance. examples are series by Irina Muravyova, by Masha Traub, for instance, and they wrote series and series of books. So it'd be good to for people to go through this chapter and really look at all these names, and especially for translators, because in some of these books there's a new Anna Karenina, and what is the bigger Russian book you can find? That's probably known. So I would also like to mention books which I particularly loved and they still not translated. One I mentioned before, this is Shame and Purity, with several characters. There is a Russian saint in it. There is a character which is probably drawn from Zemfira, Russian pop star, and her major conflict, she's struggling between being herself and also try to be very famous and to cater for the general public taste. But what would you become in that case? I think this book was particularly more important before Russia got recently politicized. In the first decade of the 21st century, the era in Russia was called glamour. It was all about glamour, but now it's changed. It's all about war. So I think this book was really important there, and it's still important for the society. But now society is so much militarized. I think it's all changing. But if you would like to know what was happening in Putin's era, like between 2000 and 2010, this is a book for you. Tatiana Moskvina, Позор, Чистота, Shame and Purity. Another book was very interesting. It's a modern discussion of the role of Dostoevsky in Russian literature. It's called Обращение вслух, Turning to Listen by Anton Ponizovsky. He's a journalist. So in this book, a set of characters, they were snowed in at the Swiss resort. And they started discussing different books and all characters. And one of the characters is doing his research on Dostoevsky and also sufferings of modern Russian. He tries to kind of view it through the eyes. So there are a lot of documents, modern documents. It's a really tragic book because each story is one more tragic than another. But the other guy who is discussing, it's very cynical. He's got a very cynical approach to Dostoevsky, that Dostoevsky didn't have a moral duty to describe his suffering because he was such a sinful man. And also he was hinting on things, how much of the child abuse in it as well. And maybe Dostoevsky was himself subjected to child abuse. So there's a lot of dirty laundry about Dostoevsky there. And it's again, as I mentioned before, it's this interplay between sinner and saint. Figure in modern Russian. I think it's one of the major struggles, because over the years, after all this economical change that happened in Russia, the society became so cynical, so money-driven, that I think this topic, sinner versus saint, becomes more and more important. Another book I'd like to mention, one of the latest book by Viktor Pelevin called T, where the main character is Count Tolstoy himself, and he is a spy, terrorist, and a kind of superhero in it. Various forces try to attempt to assassinate him while he tries to find out what the hell is happening there. I think this book is a very smart metaphor of Russia, of all the other forces applied, but it also it's a metaphor for literature itself. So basically, Pelevin likens Russia to literature. It's like one unending continuum in it. So it's one of the most fascinating from the literary point of view. I mean, for this book alone, I would give a Nobel Prize. It's very fascinating. If you like books that really fit into European definition of literary fiction, you might like Jan Losy Sergei Samsonov and his book Anomalia Kamlaeva. Why I picked that book and why I like it, I think we see a revival of a new genre in Russia that is very important, and that basically that would give potential for Russia to develop in a new way. This is the basically what we call in Russia производственный роман, the novel of labor. So it basically describes characters who over the years develop their careers, and they're inseparable from their personality. So this book is about a famous Russian composer and his love affairs with his lovers and his wife as well. This is a very unique book. It's from a young male author who created one of the finest female characters, which is quite actually unique for Russian literature. There are not that many. So I really recommend that book, but again, this has not been translated, though it received numerous prizes in Russia. So hopefully these books will be picked up soon. And another question is Russian literature all about suffering? Well, clearly not. I can show you this picture, and what you see here is the is this new phase of Russian literature. In fact, this is what most readers around the world read, what is coming from Russia. I've met several international publishers based elsewhere in the world. Russian science fiction is now dominating genre internationally. This is not it's not the most popular genre in Russia, but definitely outside the world it's become recognized as a kind of formidable power. So I think it's interesting that in Russia, when we speak of literature, it's all about just literary fiction. But around the world, it's not the case. So perhaps we shouldn't sniff at genre fiction and should take into this account. It should also be, this is how you attract readers, and maybe perhaps when they read this, they will turn to other books, to maybe more sophisticated dystopia, and from there to literary fiction. So I think it's a good entrance point. Okay, so I'm finishing here, and just before your questions, I would like to mention there are lots of, apart from the guide, there are lots of good resources online which you can find. As I mentioned, Read Russia is a company founded based in New York, and they actually hold lots of events, film and book festivals. They recently have a literary festival in New York. They support book fairs in Russia and in London as well. So, and they publish books like the Read Russia anthology. So I got the page on the Google Plus Russian literature. So where I post links of the recent events. So if people are on Google, they can also check on what's happening. Russian literature also been promoted by Russian Institute of Translation. They annually award 150 grants, I think, translation grants. So in the past 5 years, I think there are over 400 translations into like 50 languages were done by them. So we see a transformation, and the highest growth of the titles has been mostly in the US and UK. It's amazing, really, how fast the popularity grows. I think the Russian segment is growing much faster than any other national literature at the moment. So it's very popular. Another website is Russian Life, and their magazine called Chтение, and it's all about, they publish excerpts from novels or short fiction from new authors. And the publishers who specialize in Russian literature, this is Glass, New Russian Writing, and Glagoslav Publications. Also Calvert Journal, they talk about the modern culture in Russia, and including literature. So thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your questions.